Good morning, my dear friends, and welcome into this sacred moment we share together. It is in this spirit of quiet openness, the atmosphere Joel S. Goldsmith always created before he taught, that I invite you to set aside the noise of the outer world and turn, for just a few minutes, toward the still center within you. For it is in that center the great revelations of spirit are not merely heard, but realized. Today, we enter a mystery that has called to seekers for centuries, a truth hidden in plain sight within one short sentence spoken by Jesus. I and the Father are one, and most of us have read those words. Many of us have quoted them. But only a few have ever paused long enough to ask, what actually happens when you truly understand what they mean? What happens when this is not a statement about a historical figure, but a revelation about you? Stay with me, because once this truth becomes your living experience, nothing in your spiritual life and nothing in your ordinary life remains the same. In fact, it may just reveal something about yourself you were never told you possessed. Before we go deeper into this inner unveiling, I invite you to like this video, comment with the symbolic number #1 to anchor today's message, and subscribe so you don't miss the unfolding of this profound journey. Now let us step together into the meaning behind oneness and what awakens in you when it is no longer a belief, but a realization. Oneness as an inner realization, not a belief, is where the true journey begins. Not in memorizing scripture, not in adopting spiritual language, and not in repeating affirmations, but in a quiet, inward shift that cannot be forced yet can be welcomed. When Jesus declared, I and the Father are one, he was not giving us a doctrine to agree with. He was revealing a state of consciousness that every soul is invited to enter. And so, as we move from the introduction into the heart of this message, I invite you to sense what happens within you when the idea of oneness becomes more than a sentence. When it becomes a living awareness, you may discover that this realization does not come with fireworks, nor with a dramatic emotional surge, but with a profound softening, almost as if something inside you exhales for the first time. You start to recognize that oneness is not an attempt to merge yourself with something higher. It is the discovery that you were never separated in the first place. The mind might struggle with this, for the mind wants explanations, definitions, and proof. But spirit offers something far more transformative: direct experience. And it is this experience that Joel Goldsmith pointed to again and again, the shift from thinking about truth to resting in truth. Notice what begins to unfold when you no longer try to believe in God, but simply become aware of the presence that is already functioning as your life. The inner tension that comes from striving to be spiritual, striving to be good, striving to be worthy, starts to dissolve. In its place appears a quiet recognition that the Father, the Source, the infinite, invisible, has been living you, breathing you, sustaining you all along. You stop reaching outward and begin listening inward. You stop searching for God as an external power and recognize God as the very essence of your consciousness. This realization does not inflate the ego, it silences it. You no longer feel the need to defend yourself, to prove yourself, or to justify your path, because you begin to understand that you are not operating as an isolated being trying to navigate a chaotic world. You are functioning from the awareness that the very intelligence that governs galaxies is the same intelligence that guides your steps. This awareness becomes your anchor, and with that awareness comes a new way of seeing others. When you understand that I and the Father are one, you also begin to sense that this oneness is universal, that every person you meet, regardless of how they appear, is animated by that same divine life. The judgments that used to arise so quickly begin to fade, because how can you judge someone who is rooted in the same source as you? Compassion becomes natural, not as a moral effort, but as a direct outcome of your spiritual realization. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, life begins to feel less like a battle and more like a flow. You notice that situations which once triggered anxiety now meet a calmer presence within you. You start to understand the difference between knowing us about God and living us in God. And as this realization deepens, even ordinary moments, washing dishes, speaking with a friend, sitting alone in the evening, become infused with a quiet sense of sacredness. And as that quiet sacredness settles into your awareness, something else begins to shift, the subtle dissolving of the false sense of a separate self. This is not an abrupt disappearance, nor is it a mystical event that suddenly removes your personality. Rather, it is a gentle unraveling, a soft peeling away of layers that were never truly you, to begin with. The separate self, the one you've defended, protected, and presented to the world, begins to lose its gravitational pull. You start to see that what you once called me was largely a collection of fears, memories, conditioning, desires, and survival strategies. And underneath all of that, something deeper begins to shine through. This is where the second keynote reveals its power. When the false sense of separation begins to dissolve, you notice that the thoughts which used to dominate your attention no longer appear as your thoughts. They pass like clouds instead of commands. You start recognizing that the voice that constantly narrates, criticizes, and speculates is not the voice of your true being. It is simply the echo of the conditioned self trying to maintain its illusion of control. In moments of stillness, the space between you and that voice grows wider, and in that space you glimpse a freedom that is not personal but universal. As separation loosens, so does the constant tension it creates. The separate self always feels it has something to protect, something to achieve, something to fix. It lives in defense of identity, defense of opinions, defense of imagined threats. But when you begin to perceive that the self, doing all this defending, was never your essence, that heavy armor begins to fall away. You stop needing to win arguments. You stop needing to be understood or validated. You stop needing to be seen as spiritual, successful, strong, or wise. Instead, you simply vary, and that simple beingness is far more peaceful than any persona you could construct. This dissolving of separation also transforms the way you experience relationships. The instinct to judge, compare, compete, or resent begins to weaken because those reactions belong only to the egoic self that believes it is alone. When you sense your unity with the source, you naturally sense your unity with others. Their fear looks like a temporary mask, not their true identity. Their anger appears as pain, not an attack. Their distance feels like a misunderstanding, not a rejection. Compassion begins flowing without effort, because you are no longer relating from separation. You are relating from shared essence. And perhaps the most profound shift is the quiet recognition that life itself is not something happening to you. It is something unfolding through you. You no longer feel like a small being navigating a vast world. Instead, you begin to feel like the vastness that is expressing through a form. The boundaries of me and not me become blurred. The world feels less threatening, less divided, less personal. Situations that once activated deep emotional reactions now meet a presence that is spacious, receptive, and unafraid. The dissolving of the separate self is not the loss of your identity. It is the unveiling of your true identity. It is the discovery that what you are cannot be confined to a name, a story, or a body. It is the moment you realize that the life you call mine was never separate from the infinite that breathes it. And as this unveiling continues, something even more extraordinary begins to dawn within you. The realization that the divine source is the only power and presence operating anywhere, in anything, at any time. This awareness doesn't come as an intellectual conclusion, but as a living recognition that seeps into your consciousness like light rising over a horizon. You begin to notice it in subtle ways at first, perhaps in moments when you feel unexpectedly guided, or when solutions appear without strain, or when inner peace remains undisturbed despite outer circumstances. Gradually, the perception of multiple powers, good and evil, harmony and chaos, protection and threat starts to dissolve, replaced by a single, unified presence behind all activity. To recognize the divine as the only power is to experience a liberation from fear unlike anything the separate self could ever achieve. You realize that fear was always anchored in the belief in other powers, powers that could harm you, obstruct you, delay you, or diminish you. But when you begin to sense with clarity that there is no power apart from the one that expresses itself as life, as love, as intelligence, you stop negotiating with fear. You no longer spend your days trying to control outcomes or manage possibilities. Instead, you become receptive to the quiet assurance that the source which brings forth your being is the same source that governs all being. This recognition begins to transform how you engage with life. Situations that once seemed overwhelming no longer hold the same weight, because you understand that no outer circumstance possesses power of its own. It is not the storm that has power, it is the presence within the storm. It is not the challenge that has authority, it is the consciousness meeting the challenge. You begin to move through life with a deeper calm, not because everything goes your way, but because you sense that everything is held within a greater intelligence that never loses its equilibrium. In this awareness, even resistance starts to fade. Where you once felt the need to push, to force, to strive, you now begin to notice that life unfolds with a rhythm you can trust. The divine doesn't operate through struggle. It operates through order, harmony, and timing. And when you stop trying to impose your will on the flow, you become aligned with the current instead of fighting against it. What once felt like effort now feels like participation. What once felt like survival now feels like cooperation with something infinitely wiser than your personal plans. This shift also affects your sense of personal identity. When you perceive the divine as the only power, you stop attributing your successes or failures to your own strength or weakness. You understand that the activity of God, as consciousness, as awareness, as presence, is what truly moves through you. This doesn't make you passive, it makes you available. Available to inspiration instead of anxiety. Available to guidance instead of overthinking. Available to wisdom instead of reaction. You begin to act, speak, and choose from a place that is not driven by fear of consequences or desire for control, but from a quiet clarity that arises from within. And as this understanding deepens, a profound sense of security emerges, not the fragile security based on circumstances, but an inner assurance that nothing stands outside the one presence that animates all existence. And from that inner assurance, another shift begins to unfold, one so gentle and yet so unmistakable that you realize your entire way of living is being transformed. You notice that life begins to operate through effort, grace, instead of personal effort. The strain that once accompanied nearly every decision, every project, every responsibility starts to loosen its grip. It is as though an invisible weight you didn't even know you were carrying is slowly being lifted from your shoulders. You begin to realize that much of your exhaustion, much of your worry, came from the belief that you were the one holding everything together. But as the awareness of divine presence deepens, you discover that life moves more freely when you stop trying to manage it all through the limited resources of the human mind. This is not about becoming passive or disengaged, it is about recognizing the difference between action born of fear and action born of alignment. Personal effort is fueled by anxiety, by the belief that if you do not force something to happen, it will fall apart. Grace, on the other hand, emerges from trust. It is the natural flow that arises when you are no longer attempting to push the river, but allowing the river to carry you. You start acting not from compulsion, but from inspiration. Steps that once felt difficult now seem obvious and natural. Where you once felt pressured, you now feel guided. You may notice this in practical, everyday ways. Tasks that used to feel overwhelming become simpler, not because circumstances have changed, but because you are no longer approaching them from tension. Conversations unfold with more clarity because you are not rehearsing or defending, you are simply present. Opportunities appear, not because you chased them, but because your openness allowed them to surface. Even rest becomes deeper because you are not lying awake trying to solve life with thought alone. As effort gives way to grace, you begin to understand that true power does not come from straining harder or thinking faster. It comes from being inwardly aligned with the movement of spirit. This alignment brings a subtle but profound confidence, an ease that is not laziness, but clarity. You start to feel that you are not the originator of every idea, every solution, every moment of creativity. Rather, you become a channel through which wisdom flows when the mind is quiet enough to receive it. This shift also affects your relationship with time. Under the old momentum of personal effort, time always felt scarce. There was never enough of it, and you were always behind. But grace rearranges time in a way the intellect cannot understand. You may find that what once took hours now takes minutes, or that delays which used to frustrate you become perfectly timed pauses that redirect you to something better. You start trusting that life is orchestrating details you no longer need to micromanage. And perhaps one of the most beautiful signs of this transition is the softening of your inner world. The constant self-judgment, the relentless pressure to perform, the belief that your worth depends on achievement, all of these begin to fade. You start treating yourself with the same compassion you once reserved only for others. You begin honoring your own pace, listening to your own intuition, and allowing yourself to follow the rhythm of spirit rather than the demands of fear. As grace becomes your new way of being, life stops feeling like a series of battles to be won and becomes an unfolding to be witnessed, participated in, and received with openness. And as you learn to live in that unfolding, something remarkable happens, almost without your noticing. Fear, lack, and resistance begin to lose their authority. They may still appear for a moment, as old habits often do, but they no longer possess the same power to steer your actions or shape your perception. It's as though the inner spotlight that once illuminated every worst-case scenario has shifted its beam toward a deeper truth, one that reveals the temporary nature of fear, the illusion within lack, and the brittleness of resistance. You begin to sense that these energies were never the real forces governing your life. They were echoes of a belief in separation, ghosts sustained by a mind that thought it was alone. Fear, which once dictated your choices, becomes easier to recognize as a protective reflex rather than a prophecy. You notice that it tends to arise only when your mind projects itself into an imagined future or clings to a past that no longer exists. But as your awareness of the divine presence grows, you discover that fear cannot coexist with the recognition of oneness. When you feel held by something greater, something intimate, intelligent, and compassionate, fear loses its edge. It dissolves not because you fight it, but because you see through it. The same way darkness loses its reality the moment light appears, fear loses its solidity the moment awareness enters. The sense of lack begins to loosen as well. Lack is born from the belief that supply is finite, external, often conditional. It is the mindset that says, "I don't have enough," or "I must secure more before it's gone." But once you realize that the source of your life is infinite and present within your very consciousness, the old anxieties around scarcity begin to soften. You no longer look to the world as your provider, you look to the presence that sustains the world. This shift does not mean ignoring practical needs. It means recognizing that your supply flows through countless channels, not from them. And because the source is inexhaustible, you naturally begin to live with more openness, more generosity, and more trust. Resistance, too, starts to fall away. Resistance was always rooted in the belief that something out there had the power to threaten or obstruct you. It showed up as tension in the body, as stubbornness in the mind, as emotional recoil whenever life took an unexpected turn. But once you sense that there are no opposing powers, only one presence expressing itself through all things, resistance becomes unnecessary. You begin to meet life with a softer posture even when circumstances are challenging. Instead of bracing yourself, you listen. Instead of fighting, you allow. Instead of doubting, you lean into the quiet understanding that everything unfolding is part of a larger harmony you may not yet fully see. As fear, lack, and resistance loosen their hold, an inner spaciousness develops. You begin moving through the world with more fluidity, more courage, more receptivity. Situations that once triggered you now reveal opportunities for clarity. Conversations that once felt heavy become easier. Decisions that once caused anxiety become simpler because they are no longer made from a place of panic or scarcity, but from presence. You start recognizing that nothing outside you can dictate the weather of your inner life unless you hand over that authority. And gradually, you stop giving it away. What emerges in this space is not the absence of challenges, but the presence of a new capacity to meet them from a higher place within yourself. And as this new capacity unfolds, something even deeper rises within you, a quiet recognition that your consciousness becomes a channel for healing and light. This does not mean you suddenly take on a role or title, nor does it imply that you begin performing dramatic acts. It is far more subtle, far more intimate than that. It begins as an inner awareness that something is moving through you that is not of your personal mind, not of your personal will. A presence, a peace, begins to emanate from you without effort, the way fragrance naturally emanates from a flower. You do not try to radiate it. It simply flows because there is no longer anything within you blocking its movement. This shift occurs because your consciousness has been cleared of the clutter that once obscured the light: fear, resistance, separation, overthinking. As those patterns loosen, what remains is a transparency through which the divine can express itself without distortion. You begin to notice that people feel calmer around you, even when you say nothing. You find yourself listening in a way that allows others to feel genuinely seen, and in that seeing, something in them softens. You aren't trying to heal, healing happens as a byproduct of your presence. There may be moments when insight comes to you spontaneously, answers to questions you didn't know you needed to ask, solutions to problems that once felt impossible. These insights don't feel like something you constructed with effort, they feel like something you received. You might find yourself offering words that comfort or uplift someone, only to realize later that you don't know where those words came from. And that is the beauty of this awakening. You become aware that the intelligence of the infinite is speaking, guiding, and moving through you. This does not elevate you above anyone. On the contrary, it brings a profound humility. You recognize that you are not the source of the light. You are simply the instrument through which the source plays its melody. And because there is no ego claiming ownership, the flow becomes even more natural, unforced, and continuous. You begin living in a state of quiet availability, ready to respond when moved, ready to be still when silence is needed. Your presence becomes healing because it carries no agenda. People sense that you are not trying to change them, fix them, or influence them. They feel safe in your presence because you are rooted in the awareness of oneness, and that awareness sees everyone as already whole beneath their temporary struggles. This recognition creates an atmosphere of acceptance, and acceptance is one of the greatest healers in the world. Even your environment responds. You may notice that situations that once felt chaotic now settle more easily. Conflicts dissipate faster. Misunderstandings resolve with surprising ease. This is not because you are manipulating outcomes, but because the consciousness you carry influences the field around you. You bring coherence where there was discord, clarity where there was confusion, and calm where there was tension. And as this continues, you start to view every interaction, every moment, as an opportunity to let this inner light extend outward, not through doing, but through being. You move through life with a quiet intention to remain aligned with the presence within you, trusting that this alignment is itself a form of silent blessing wherever you go.